Good morning. Thank you for having me. I was actually going to ask if anybody had heard of Hashgraph previously, but obviously Robert sort of stole my thunder there a little bit, so now everybody's heard of Hashgraph, but hopefully I can sort of clarify some things, answer some questions, but more specifically talk about why we think Hashgraph is going to be really interesting for micropayments. So I'm Patrick. I run product at Hashgraph. I've been there about 6 months or so. Very few organizations in this industry are actually that old, so I almost feel like an old timer now after 6 months, given what we've experienced and what we've been through. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here, an intro to Hashgraph, and then some of where and how we think it applies to micropayments. I've got about 15 minutes. I could actually probably spend 2 hours talking about this stuff, honestly, to do it justice. So I'm going to give you a taste for this stuff. Happy to answer some questions, but I'll also be here afterwards as well if people want to spend some time talking about these things as well. Happy to do that. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to sort of riff on Robert here a little bit. I completely agree that the internet has been sort of missing what I'll call an economic layer for the last 30 years. And what we've essentially done is tried to leverage, or have leveraged, payment platforms that really were built for physical assets and physical resources, and tried to retrofit that into the digital world. All right. What's resulted is some interesting sort of issues and gaps where it hasn't really quite fit. We haven't really been able to take it all the way to solve some of those problems, and some interesting sort of business models and interesting issues have resulted. One example is the ability to read online content. Okay, the business models around that have either been sort of give it away, or put in place a paywall of some form where I have to pay some sort of subscription on a monthly basis to get access to that content. All right, when I get sent a link to an article in the Wall Street Journal, I'd love to read it, but I don't really want to pay $9 on a monthly basis from now on in just to read that one article, so I rarely read it. I sort of drop off. So we really haven't had the ability for people to pay 10 cents, a cent, 5 cents, whatever it is, just to read that one newspaper article very easily and very seamlessly. If we had, I think we wouldn't have paywalls in this situation. All right. Certainly when I'm interested in maybe 5 or 10 or 15 different content distribution, whether it's Wikipedia, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, magazine, stuff like that. I'm not going to sign up for subscriptions for all of them, essentially, in that situation. Another example is online music. All right, Apple almost got there when they started to sell songs for 99 cents, but that completely broke down as soon as we went to streaming, and the fact that I can listen to every single song ever created for $9 a month or whatever it is. And I actually do that. I actually think that's pretty good value. I mean, I'd probably do the same thing for newspaper articles as well, but nobody has a service to do that. Unfortunately, in this situation, what we've completely missed is the artists. The artists are making no money. They're completely getting cut out of the situation here, and they're not monetizing their creative contributions in any way. All right, they're making all of the money's going to those streaming services in this regard. So the ability for an artist to be able to stream a song and for me to pay 5 cents, a cent, 10 cents to listen to that song and be able to pay the artist directly is a big deal. That way. Okay, so part of the problem here is because we haven't sort of had an economic model to sort of pay for digital assets and digital resources. What's resulted is these different business models emerging. I've highlighted a couple, but the other big one is obviously advertising. And in the case of advertising, we've basically just become immune to the fact that we're sort of giving up all sorts of data about ourselves from a privacy standpoint so that people can basically target ads at us. And we've become the product, as Tim Cook said. Again, not a great situation to be in, but it's a ramification of the fact that with the existing payment models that we've tried to apply, the cost and the latency of trying to use those payment models on the internet for digital resources just doesn't cut it. It just doesn't work. So I think if we can unlock that, if we can basically enable an economic layer or payment system where the constant transactions and the latency and the user experience is good enough, I think we can sort of, we have something. It's not like we haven't tried, all right? It's not like we always basically said we're just going to live with Visa and MasterCard. There's been attempts to solve this now for like close to 20, 25 years. But in every case, they've fallen short in regards to those things I mentioned. Cost and latency and user experience, generally speaking, is what's fallen down in those situations. I haven't even heard of some of these things. We actually found them. I think actually Robert mentioned some of these previously, actually. So I'm glad I'm sort of enforcing or reinforcing some of the things he was saying. So that's what we're trying to solve, basically. One of the things we're trying to solve with Hashgraph. So what is Hashgraph? Hashgraph at its core is a consensus algorithm, a new consensus algorithm. It's not blockchain, all right? This is a sort of an overview of what we see in blockchain. What wasn't mentioned at all today, I think, is the recognition that both blockchain and Ethereum are very slow. They perform poorly. Anywhere between 4 to 15 to 20 transactions per second. There's not a lot you can do, I think, with 15 to 20 transactions per second on an append-only database. It's not a lot you can do. So I know people are working on mechanisms to fix that in that world, and that's great. All for that. As much innovation as possible is fine. But we look at Hashgraph as an alternative, starting with a new consensus layer that sort of addresses some of those limitations. Hashgraph was invented by a gentleman called Lehman Baird. Lehman sort of came up with this maybe 3 or 4 years ago. He was looking at this in the case or the problem of how do I solve massive distributed online gaming, where if I'm running the games in a peer-to-peer environment and I have 2 people on 2 different PCs who want to pick up the axe at the same time, how do I decide who picked it up first? And Hashgraph was the result. What's novel about this is that he's actually falling back on consensus algorithms around voting that were invented in the 70s that were proven to be secure, but were impossible to implement because the transaction throughput necessary to make them work completely overloads any network in terms of the number of messages that has to be transferred back and forth in voting. And he solved this with some novel approaches about adding some pieces of information to messages that are gossiped out to the network, and then from there gossiped out again. And that as a result of that piece of information, every node ends up having the same understanding of what every other node knows about the transactions, and then does virtual voting and votes on it itself. But I'm giving you a 30-second summary of a white paper that I suggest you guys take a look at. There's also videos of Aleem that explains this as well. So it's high performance and secure are the key things here that we think. So Hashgraph, at its basis, it's just a consensus algorithm. We could have taken that technology and applied it to anything. We decided to take it and apply it to building out a public DLT, a public distributed ledger. All right. When we think about public distributed ledgers today, there are sort of 4 aspects to those things that we like to talk about: technology, security, stability, and governance. And we sort of took another look at how you might look to sort of solve those things in the context of a public DLT, with the mindset that we wanted enterprises to adopt this technology. We hadn't seen much enterprise adoption of the other DLTs in the space. A lot of interest about it, a lot of buzz, but most enterprises have been doing private DLTs. So we took a look at what we thought was missing and tried to fix that in our model. Excuse me. So it starts with the technology. At its basis is Hashgraph, the consensus model. On top of Hashgraph, we've added 3 services. One is the cryptocurrency that I'll talk about probably in more detail. The other is Solidity smart contracts. The last one is sort of a file storage service. Solidity is there to allow people to migrate their Ethereum apps over to us if they so choose. And so we can basically have portability, which is great. The cryptocurrency, though, is interesting in that it is there for probably 3 reasons. The first is it's there for security. If we have lots of nodes in the network that are gossiping amongst each other and they're voting, if every node had a voting weight of 1, we become vulnerable to something called a Sybil attack, where if there's 100 nodes and China springs up 200 bots that all act as nodes, they can overwhelm the network if more than a third of the participants in the network are bad, and it breaks consensus. By adding something of value to the voting system such that a node has to have a certain amount of currency, and that currency is the weight of their vote, now it's not just the number of nodes, you need to have a third of the currency to overwhelm the network. And obviously our expectation is this currency, as it's distributed, becomes more valuable and becomes very difficult to get more than 33% of the currency. The second thing, it's an economic model. The currency is used to pay the nodes or reward the nodes for being public nodes and gossiping transactions. All right, 5 more minutes? Wow, okay, I'll be fast. So the applications and the wallets pay fees to basically use the network, and that's what pays the nodes and rewards the nodes, basically. So we're fast, hundreds of thousands of transactions per second in a shard. We think we can get latency in a few seconds. And we're fair in that the ordering of the transactions is basically handled by the network basically on the mean time, okay? Keep going. Did I skip over security? Yes. There we go. Security I touched on. Sybil attack resistant, DDoS resistant. Something I'll just mention, ABFT, asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerant, gold standard for security of distributed consensus systems. So just take a look, research that, it's a big deal. Stability, next thing that's important for us. This is sort of backed up by the fact that one of the things that enterprises were very worried about is the forking of some of the existing platforms. They didn't want to invest heavily in developing on a platform that could fork tomorrow and their DApp and their currency can just get brought up on some other competing network. So we're leveraging the fact that Hashgraph is patented and we have an IP around it, okay, to basically ensure that Hedera won't fork and people can be comfortable it's going to be there and there's not going to be a copy of it. The second is that we're making the source code open review and that people can look at the source code, compile the source code, run the source code, know that that's what the source code is that's running in the network. Lastly, we have governance. From a governance standpoint, we think of governance as being sort of orthogonal to consensus. Governance is who makes the decisions around what the fees are, who makes the decisions about what should be added to the network, what new services should exist, who makes the decisions about compliance and regulatory issues. We're looking to have 39 organizations, large global brands, that will be part of a council, okay, that will run nodes on the network, that won't be sort of incented in any way separately. I mean, they're not being paid to do this. They're not being paid profits to do this. They are basically sort of think of them as stewards of the network to basically act as I said, stewards in this case. We're looking at global brands across all regions, Australia, India, Asia, the US, Europe, Africa, South America, and across multiple industries. Financial services, telco, legal, services, manufacturing, as many as possible. All right, so we're getting a wide spectrum of organizations with very different sort of incentive models to why they want to participate handling in this. What's also key is that they're term limited. All right, they can't do this for more than 6 years before they have to basically leave for 3 years and we bring in different members into that. So again, it's a case of trying to make it as decentralized as possible in terms of the organizations that are involved. I'm getting my 1 minute signal. So why do we think this is really interesting for micropayments? All right, it's the fact that A, no license is going to be required to use the network. All right, you can build your dApp or use your wallet and leverage the network, essentially no license required. You'll pay fees to do it, but that's okay. All right, the performance is going to be really good. The latency is going to be really good. And we're going to have very, very low transaction fees. And what I'm looking at there, or we're thinking about there, is around a basis point for a currency transfer, which means that we can get it down to people transferring a penny or even a tenth of a penny and be able to support that. We'll have a minimum, I think, fee, because if we don't have any, there's a problem with free, I think. So we'll have a minimum fee just to ensure that people don't, swarm the network with spam and don't try and overload it. So there will be a minimum there. So no license required, low transaction fees. And just a shout out and endorsement here from the guys at Hero FM. They're one example of a dApp that's buying into this model for micropayments. In this case, it's actually for the music industry to basically monetize music for the artists in that situation. Matt, I'm done. Thank you.
Excellent. Perfect timing. Okay, we can take a few questions from the audience before we let Patrick go. Sir.
So you talked about the IP and the fact that you guys are open source. How do you protect from forking or just a copy since it's open source? And how strong is the IP since I guess a lot of the technology used were built from free, still open source knowledge?
Sure. So I was very clear to say open review and not open source. So we don't have an open source license on the software. We're allowing people to view it, to compile it, to review it, and to watch it change, but there's no open source license on it, essentially. So it's in the public domain, but it doesn't have, for example, an Apache license or something like that.
I guess if it's open review, people can just copy it?
Yes.
You could get just a copy?
Yes.
Even if it's, let's say, an illegal copy? Or?
Well, so they can license it from us. If they wanted to leverage Hashgraph in a sort of permissioned network setting, they can certainly come and license that from us, just like you can go to Oracle and people like that. But in the case of the public network, we're trying to not allow that to happen so that we don't see, forked platforms emerging. Now, obviously, we're reliant on our IP in that situation, which works in some countries, doesn't work in others. We're just having to deal with that and live with that in that situation.
Right, and how strong is the IP?
Say that again?
How strong is the IP?
How strong is the IP?
Is it a US IP or?
It's US and other I call them Western countries that we've basically filed in as well. Okay.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's give a big round of applause for Patrick.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.